hard, having fun, run right through a barrel of rum. No, I'm not the only one, you gotta respect my fun. Yeah, gotta respect my fun. Oh, gotta respect my fun.
Soon may the wellerman come, bring us coffee, tea, and rum. One day the tonguing is done, take our leave and go.
Well, in my most recent build video, I cooked up a mighty Warmouth box coracle, a 4-foot boat. Pretty goofy. I think some viewers found it entertaining, some didn't quite get it. But I had fun, and I will occasionally get into some weirder projects like a 4-foot boat that are just for fun, are just kind of novelty projects. And oftentimes I end up learning from those novelty projects. I end up learning things or being led to unexpected destinations as a result. So where the Warmouth led me was here. So when the Warmouth was finished, it weighed, now I'm just going off of memory, but it weighed something like 40 to 50 pounds. Now, 40 to 50 pounds you can carry in a backpack. That's a heavy backpacking loadout. Now, in this day and age, most people don't go backpacking with that much weight. It's going to be hard on your body. But I have been into rucking as a fitness activity, which is just carrying weight to get stronger and to get a workout. And 50 pounds was my max at one point. I could go a mile and a half carrying 50 pounds. And I only did it a couple of times and it kind of tore up my body. But, you know, I was intentionally pushing myself to do that. So where am I going with this? Well, I got to thinking, this boat is almost small and light enough that I could carry it on my back and pack it in to, say, a remote pond or creek to use it as a fishing float. But it was just a little bit too heavy and a little bit too bulky for that to be practical. So that brings me to my next build that you're about to see unfold here, the ultralight version of the Warmouth box coracle. So the idea was to trim off as much fat as possible from the original Warmouth design and also make the hull's footprint a little bit smaller overall in order to get something that I could haul on my back with pack straps and walk into some remote areas and get to some small waters to go fishing. And you'll see that it ends up being a completely different style of construction in order to accomplish this. I'm using some experimental materials. I'm using 5mm plywood and cedar fence pickets. Now, even if you're not interested in my novelty boat building, you may still get something out of this video. I think I have some pretty useful tips that I revealed throughout this process that are definitely applicable to some of my other designs or just boat building or DIY projects in general. So here we go, the Warmouth ultralight version. I begin with 4 cedar fence pickets laid out on my handy boat builder's picnic table. I'm about to draw the curve of the bottom, and it's really pretty simple. You just need to drive 3 nails temporarily, and then you're going to take a big yardstick or a flexible piece of wood and bend it against the nails and trace that curve to give the bottom a little bit of rocker. So right here I have a nail driven right in the middle of the board, just inside the edge to allow for the thickness of the ruler. and to prevent the board from splitting out. So it's probably about an 1/8 inch inside the edge, and then I have a nail on each end that you just measure up from the lower corner of your sideboard, and also drive that nail about an 1/8 inch in from the edge. And I'm just gonna take my yardstick and push it up against the 3 nails from this lower edge of the board and trace that curve. So if you're working by yourself, it can be easier to go to the inside of the nail on the ends and to the outside of the nail on the center. And you can see that the yardstick will just sit there and hold its curve, and now you are free to trace. And going this way will give the bottom a little bit more of a curve than if you were to just go to the outside of the nails, but it's really not a significant difference. Either way is fine. So I've got my bow and stern rake marked out, penciled in, and I'm getting ready to cut them on the chop saw, which is possible when you're working with 2 narrower boards rather than 1 big wide sideboard. So there is a little bit of convenience in being able to cut these angles individually. Alright, so I've got one side of the boat cut to shape with the rocker on the bottom and the raked bow and stern. Now I'm just going to take that finished side and lay it out on my opposite side and trace that curve in the angle of the bow and stern and just cut out what I trace with a jigsaw. The sideboards are finished, and just a reminder, a review, what we have is an upper plank and a lower plank. The upper plank is ripped to be a little bit narrower than the original width of the board, but it has straight sides all the way along the plank. It just has the rake angle cut at both ends. And the lower plank is left at stock width, but it has the rake angle cut to match the upper plank, and it has the curve or rocker of the bottom jigsawed out. So really pretty simple, and it's just like the original Warmouth design. It's just that we're getting the sides out of 2 planks per side, and the reason for that is to be able to utilize this super light cedar fence board stock. So we're still maintaining the traditional feel of solid boards, but really reducing a lot of weight from the original design that used 1x12 pine boards. From this leftover end of one of my side planks, I'm about to rip out the vertical frames. So I need 4 frames, and each one is 7/8 by 9.5. Just gonna rip that out on the table saw, and these are just some vertical boards that tie the halves of each side of the boat together, each sideboard assembly. My frames are sanded down and finished, and I just cut a 40-degree angle on both ends just to avoid having any sharp points inside the boat. And then at each station along the sideboard assembly, I've just scribed a line using my square, using that square upper edge of the plank at the designated station for each vertical rib, and then I drilled pilot holes for my number 9 by 1 1/4 deck screws, which will be driven in from the outside of the plank into the frame. And that means I'm gonna have to clamp the frames to the sideboards while I'm doing that. If you have a helper, you can maybe just have your helper hold on to the frame. The rib is just centered up on my line, and I've got both of them clamped down. And I really need to get some smaller clamps for stuff like this. These big gigantic clamps are the only ones I have in this style, this lever style, which is a really convenient type of clamp. So I need to get some smaller ones, but these will work. Now I can just turn it up on edge and drive a screw from the back, and that'll get that rib held in place. With my vertical ribs screwed onto the lower plank, now I just need to line up that upper plank, and I want to countersink my screw holes as well as pre-drilling into the rib, and then I can just drive my screws for the upper plank. And it may be tempting to use some clamps to try and tighten up the joint here, but I don't think that's going to be a good idea, because if the wood absorbs moisture, and it probably will, then it's going to have a tendency to swell up, and then those planks will actually be pushing against each other, which is not really what you want. And actually in my case, I don't really expect to have to caulk this joint. I just don't think it's going to be necessary for my application, for the way that I expect to use the boat. But if it was going to be carrying more weight or used in rougher water maybe, which it really shouldn't be used in any kind of rough water, then yeah, you might want to come up with some sort of way to caulk that. And you could use traditional cotton caulking, in which case I believe the groove here is actually supposed to be cut or beveled to be a V shape, or you could probably just get away with regular old silicone caulk. So before I move on to assembly, there's one last thing to do to the sideboards. From my board ends left over from the cedar fence pickets, I've cut 4 more strips to 5/8 by 1 1/8 by pretty long, just longer than the end of the board here. And these are going to be little batten boards, just to give the thin plywood transom a little more surface area to mate to and get glued and screwed on. So just laid down a bead of glue here, and this is actually Loctite Power Grab, not PL Premium. You could use PL Premium, or you could actually use Titan Tybond 3. I would recommend for gluing all the ribs and for these little end battens. But anyways, I'm gonna secure this batten in with the bead of glue plus a couple of screws that are really just kind of holding and clamping screws, just to hold the batten in tight while the glue's setting up. And I've got the batten board cut long there, so once I get it fastened down, I'm just going to trim off those ends with a handsaw. These 1 1/4 inch screws are just a little bit too long for this, so they are poking out the opposite side of the board here. And you could use shorter screws like 1 inch, or just do what I do and file that point down just so it doesn't poke anybody. And when you get paint over it and you get it blunted off with a file, it's really not a big deal. Alright, I'm about to start assembling the hull, and it looks kind of crazy like this. I've just got that fence picket on the top cut to 40 inches, and I've got a screw, one screw in each end, just temporarily holding up the sideboards as I begin to assemble and fasten on the transoms on both ends. So the transom is screwed and glued onto the end of the sideboards, and you're looking at the bow with the boat flipped upside down right now. And I've been kind of trying to figure out the best order of assembly when you get to this point, and there's different ways you could do it, but I think the best way is going to be to fasten and glue your transoms to the sideboards and then come in with your little framing pieces of 3/4 inch cedar and just slide those right in there. It may take a little bit of adjustment, meaning you may have to make some small saw cuts to adjust the length of these little frames. And you'll notice that this chine edge here is not finished. I'm leaving the board standing up just a little bit on purpose, and I'm gonna come in with my power planer, or you could probably do this with just a belt sander, or even hand sanding, or even just a carving knife or something. This wood is so soft and easy to work, it doesn't really matter what you use. But this edge of both transoms just needs to be made flat so that the plywood has a good flat mounting surface, the plywood bottom. So this 5mm ply that I'm using is very experimental. I have no idea how this stuff is going to hold up. It may start to delaminate pretty quickly because I'm pretty sure it's not meant for exterior use. And I also noticed that it seems to be manufactured in a different way than common plywood. But what's nice about it mainly is how light it is, and it also doesn't have any voids that I can see in the end grain, which is a good thing, because that's really what kills plywood, is when you have some open voids that allows water to get in. But the big question with this stuff is how the glue that was used to laminate the wood is going to hold up to water. And I'm thinking it should be all right, at least for a good long while, or at least for a while, as long as I, keep it reasonably sealed up with paint. This stuff is almost hilariously structureless. It's just squishy, but once I get it secured to these little framing strips, I think it's going to be plenty rigid. Fastening the transoms in, I start by putting a locator screw in each corner of the transom, and the boat is upside down still. So I'll get the transom located and just verify I have a good fit before laying down my bead of PL Premium along the butt end of the side plank. So everything looks good with the transom just temporarily screwed on with these two locator screws. So I'm going to remove the transom, lay down my bead of glue, and go ahead and screw it down permanently. And I'm using number 6 by 1 1/4 screws, and these have really small heads, which is necessary for this thin 5mm plywood. So I accidentally bought PL Premium, the Fast Grab version, which is a little more expensive, and it comes out gray instead of tan. And this stuff works. I've used it before, but it's kind of hard to work with. It's a little thicker, it seems, and it's just kind of hard to get it to come out of the tube. So I would not recommend buying Fast Grab. I would just get the cheapest PL Premium. That's really what I prefer anyways. So I've got this end of the side planks glued, and I still have one little locator screw right here with the transom hanging on, and I'm just gonna pivot the transom up and screw it down here, and then repeat that for the opposite side. It's important to have a good tight joint here on the transoms to the sideboards and to the bottom, and I've got glue squirting out. That's a good sign. Probably means I've got a tight joint. And if I look on the inside, it looks like both surfaces are mating flat to each other, and that's what you want. So now I'm just gonna scrape off that excess glue and fasten the other side. You'll notice that I have 2 columns of screws here, and the nearer column are getting driven into the end grain of the sideboards themselves, and this farther column of screws are being driven in to the vertically oriented batten board, I think I'm calling that. And there's a huge difference between the two. The screws driven into the end grain of the sideboards really don't get a very good bite. Most of them don't. They have to be countersunk pretty deep in order for the screw heads to actually sit flush to the surface of the plywood transom. On the other hand, the screws driven into the batten get a really good bite, and they don't even have to be countersunk. The screws will actually pull themselves deep enough into the wood, which is really more what you want. So you'll remember on our end battens, there's only 2 screws holding that batten to the sideboards, but it's also glued to the sideboards, and the transoms are glued to the sideboards and the end batten. So it's securely held, but you can kind of see we end up with sort of a crisscrossing mess of screws here on the corners of the boat, and that really is one of the big reasons why I don't love building with plywood. Because if you're sticking with traditional construction, meaning fasteners, it really complicates things, because you need a lot of structural members like ribs and battens and frames to hold the thing together. So it just ends up being a lot more complicated way to build. And personally, I just prefer the traditional feel of solid plank. However, the one benefit, of course, in my mind, the one benefit, or at least the main benefit of using plywood, is saving a lot of weight. You do end up with a much lighter boat, and that's what I'm going for here with the ultralight version of the Warmouth. It's coming together. I've added a few different ribs here in the bottom. I'm gonna have 2 ribs which are spaced, I don't know, roughly like 10 or 11 inches apart, just off the center line, or the midship line is right there. And I've marked out the position of these ribs in the bottom with a pencil and pre-drilled for number 6 by 1 1/4 screws. And I also ended up adding a third rib in the middle of my two sideboard ribs there, vertical ribs. Just needed to get the boat stiffened up a little more. The fence pickets are really soft and pretty flexible, but they're also very light, and that's the whole idea, of course. And this 5mm revolution ply is awfully squishy when unsupported, and it may not work very well at all. That will be interesting to see how that experiment turns out. But I think with these ribs added in the bottom and maybe some external stiffeners running fore and aft, I think she should end up pretty sturdy. Alright, that is the build. The Ultralight Warmouth ended up being somewhere between 25 and 30 pounds when complete. And that is a big difference from the original Warmouth. That was somewhere between 40 and 50 pounds. So at this point, with the hull finished up, I just went ahead and slapped a coat of Bullseye 123 primer on the interior and the top sides. And I took some of the leftover paint from my Pelican punt build to get a coat of paint on the bottom, and I headed for the creek to begin the first round of testing and to see whether this thing would actually be the backpack boat that I wanted it to see if I would really be able to carry it safely and effectively using pack straps over any sort of distance, and to see, of course, how it would float and how it would handle. So now we are headed down to the creek to do some testing. So there you have it, the Ultralight Warmouth. I'd say it worked. It was not too bad to carry on my back at all. Really, the hard part is setting it down. I kind of had to do some figuring out on that. You have to be careful when you set it down, and you really would not want to fall while wearing a boat on your back, needless to say. So potentially a little bit hazardous to walk through the woods carrying a boat, even a boat as small as the little Warmouth. What I did notice about this ultralight version is that it was not very stable. The bigger version was plenty stable. I could even stand up and move around as much as you can, shuffle around in a 4-foot boat. But standing up in this little one, really not a good idea. It tends to pick up the bow and just wobble all around. And that's something I've noticed throughout my boat building trials, is that a heavier boat is noticeably more stable. It's a lot more stable. And you'll really notice that going from a fiberglass or ABS plastic boat to a wooden boat. The wooden boat is going to be a lot more stable. So it's just one of those things that you find out when you get into this. So there you have it, Warmouth Ultralight. And remember, I still do have plans available for the original Warmouth 4. And yes, mostly just for fun, mostly a novelty project, but also a good place to start if you want to get into boat building or even just woodworking or DIY projects in general, and you don't know where to begin. That's a really low investment, low stress way to get going. Start with a Warmouth 4. I will link those plans in the description. If you found this novelty boat build entertaining, be sure to come back for next week's episode, where I am packing the Ultralight Warmouth into a remote creek to go fishing. And this was back in the spring in western Kentucky, so there's a good chance that I'm actually gonna catch something at least. And other than that, before you go, please remember to check out my brand new music channel. It's only been up for maybe a couple of weeks at this point, and I'm already regularly uploading original folk songs and covering some old classic tunes, bluegrass, blues, and old-time country music, especially on my homemade instrument, my banjo, which is kind of like some of my boats, a little bit odd, but it works. It's basically a homemade banjo. The body was made out of a steel cake pan that I got for $3 at Walmart, and carved the neck out of a stick of wood. So I will roll in a little sample of my music here, a sample music video to demonstrate the type of thing you can expect to find over on my music channel, Cumberland Rover Music. So give it a look and a listen. Thank you very much for stopping by. Thank you for your support, and I will see you on next week's video.
In the morning light by the riverside, rolling out the main and the spars and the lines. We're cool wind running from Dover way, and now we're paying out the anchor on Terrapin Bay. Spirits running high, river keeps a rolling by, full sail set to fly, and the river keeps rolling by and by. In the evening light, when catfish bite, flake out the main and furl it up tight. A guitar's picking out a sailor's tune, and everybody's dancing by the light of the moon. Spirits running high, sails set to fly, and the river keeps rolling by and by. In the morning light by the riverside, rolling out the main and the spars and lines. South wind blowing on Terrapin Bay, and we're running on down the Smithland Way. Spirits running high, river keeps a rolling by. Old sails set to fly, and the river keeps rolling by and by. Yeah, spirits running